Okay, boys and girls, today we're going to do something of a system review, but we're really doing it to try to look at the specific components involved. And those components are the JL Audio D108 subwoofers, the Magnepan LRS Plus loudspeakers, and the Legacy Wavelet DSP preamp. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, as you might know, we've been on a little bit of a search for subwoofers to go with the Magnepan LRS Plus. That's because Jonathan Vallon and I and several other editors of the Absolute Sound happen to think the Magnepan LRS Plus is a really, really good speaker and a tremendous value because it's $1,000 or a little bit more with the stands, which you really should get. So let's say $1,200 or $1,250. I don't quite remember, but that's the approximate price point. Anyway, they're a screaming deal for a speaker that does a lot of what many more expensive products also try to do. They may not be quite as successful, but they do. It's 90% for 20% of the price kind of thing. So that's why we used the Magnepans in this review. But the Magnepans are dipoles, and dipoles naturally have some limitations in the bass due to the way that they radiate both front and rear, and then there's cancellation of some bass wavelengths at a certain point. I could explain the formula to you, but just accept that there's a natural roll-off with dipole speakers, and that has some difficulties in how it gets corrected by the manufacturers. Magnepan are maybe the world's experts on doing this, certainly with planar magnetics, but they can't defy the laws of physics. That's where subwoofers come in. So if you love Magnepans from, say, 100 hertz on up, and you'd like to not overdrive them, you start to think about, hey, these things are really good, and they're really good standalone, but what would they be like with a subwoofer? So I called the nice folks at JL Audio because they make relatively inexpensive, they make expensive subwoofers too, but they make some relatively inexpensive subwoofers that other editors have listened to and enjoyed, and I wanted to start in a pretty good place. So I chose the Dominion D108, which is a $1,200 subwoofer. I chose to use two because we're having a conversation here that puts together main speaker, subwoofers, and room acoustics. And if you have two, you can put them at the quarter wavelength point, and that gives you a little bit less triggering of some of the room resonances that you inevitably have to deal with. Whether that's the optimal setup or not, there are many arguments about this, and I think the measurements would say it's not optimal, but it's optimal within the realm of what you're realistically probably going to do at this kind of price point. Anyway, so I had two Dominion D108 subwoofers. So that means if you bought the system I'm talking about, I've allocated twice as much of the budget to woofers as I have to the main speakers. But again, you kind of got to get your mind past the, I only spend $1,000 on the main speakers, and therefore everything else should kind of harmonize with that in some weird numerology. And you just got to roll with, what do I need to make this work? And good subs tend to start in that $1,000 or so price range, so I chose the JLs, put them at the quarter wavelength points on the wall behind the speaker. That's aesthetically nice and acoustically maybe okay. Great. All right, so now we have a main speaker with speakers with a pair of subwoofers. But what I did that's different, because I think this is really what makes the conversation intriguing, although I will come back and in another episode talk about the JLs without DSP, but I used a DSP preamp, the Legacy Wavelet, and I used it because it has a DSP system that I think is unusual and makes sense to me technically. Those of you who like to get involved in technical arguments may have some reasoning that goes beyond my pay grade. But what's interesting about the Wavelet DSP is, there are many things, but the core simple takeaway about the Wavelet DSP is it's done in the time domain, not in the frequency domain. This is not just a computer-powered equalizer. It's computer-powered, and it's doing adjustments to the output of the speakers, but it's measuring that in the time domain because it's trying to take into account the resonances in the room, and the resonances in your room inevitably are not just a frequency phenomenon, but like all resonances, there's some time decay involved, and Boehmer, the designers of the circuitry that's in the Wavelet, the DSP circuitry that's in the Wavelet preamp, are trying to address that time element as well as the frequency element. Anyway, it's all a little bit complicated. Legacy has some nice white papers on this subject if you want to read them, but I think you can fairly easily understand if you've ever blown across the top of a wine glass and gotten it to resonate or played any musical instrument, that resonances can have different lengths of time in which the resonating device, in this case your room, is resonating. And if there are different time constants for the resonances that we're dealing with, then we better well deal with them. And you can't just do that in the frequency domain. You have to do your measurements in the time domain and then make adjustments. That's what Legacy and Boehmer are trying to do. And anyway, we'll see in a minute how it worked. Okay, first let's talk about the equipment, just so you know what we're talking about. Starting with subwoofers, I'm going to skip over the Magnepans because we've done multiple videos on them, and they're right here. They're magneplaners that are about 4 feet tall and a foot wide and an inch thick, and they work on the planar magnetic principle. And yeah, you can read about that, or we might even do a whole audio basics video on how planar magnetic speakers work. But for right now, that's been described adequately, I think. The JL Audio D108 subwoofers are a small, roughly 1 foot cubed size cube, and they have an 8-inch driver in them and a 500 watt Class D amplifier and a variety of inputs, so you can hook up different kinds of equipment to them, a built-in crossover, which I did not use, level control, which I set to the neutral point on the curve, and they're a sealed box arrangement, and fairly simple. I do want to say, having heard multiple JL audio subwoofers, JL is also in this strange category of, they do have some secret sauce that is a little bit tough to point to and say, oh, it's the Framjazit integrated circuit that makes the difference. But they've been doing this a long time, and they seem to really care about music, so JL subs just seem to work quite nicely in a lot of situations. We'll see in a moment if they did here, but that's why we chose them. Simple, not super expensive, and pretty easy to place because they're small. All right, now let's get to the Legacy preamp. The Legacy preamp is multiple devices in one box. You can see the box here. We'll put some images of it on the screen so you can see what you're talking about. But It's a preamp with a D to A converter and a DSP room correction system and a crossover system. So what that means is the Legacy is really an integrated front-end box. You know, back in the day, like the 1980s, the two integrated pieces we might talk about are, we would talk about integrated amplifiers, which is a preamplifier and an amplifier together in a single box. And we might, maybe, the high-end guys weren't really in love with this, but we might talk about receivers, which is an amplifier, a preamplifier, and a tuner in a single box. Now, in 2023, we have a lot of different component circuitry together that's mixed into different combinations of boxes. But I think it's important to keep straight that here we're talking about 4 kinds of devices that are integrated into a single box, and that helps you understand better, I think, the value equation that's on offer here. So I'm going to say it's about a $6,000 device where each of the underlying components costs you about $1,500 because there are 4 of them. And if you look around, trying to find a programmable crossover system for $1,500, not so easy. A DSP box that is made with leading edge technology for $1,500, not so easy. A DAC for $1,500, totally easy. We'll talk a little bit about how good this one is, just as a sidebar, but nonetheless, $1,500 is, you know, mid-range for DSPs, depending on the people you hang out with. Maybe it's low end, but it's not a huge amount of money for D to A converter. So that's $1,500. And then a $1,500 preamp. And again, you can find preamps for a little bit less than $1,500. But not that many, so it's a relatively inexpensive preamp. What I'm trying to get across here is just the simple idea that all of the stuff packed in this box is actually priced quite reasonably. It's just that when you put it all together, you end up with a $6,000 box, but I don't think you could get this combination of features for less. So if it works, it, in my mind, constitutes good value. All right, now let's get on to how it works and why it's set up the way it is. Okay, step 1. When you buy a Legacy Wavelet preamp, you specify the crossover frequencies that you want to use. You can actually, it's got enough outputs. If I show you here, we'll probably take a video of the back of it, but I can show you here. It's got 2 sets of outputs with crossover filters on them, and then I had it set up with full range outputs as well, so I could run it without the crossover involved. It's quite flexible, but you have to pick some crossover frequencies. The factory sets them for you at your specified points. That means you could send it back to the factory to get it adjusted at a later date if you chose a different combination of features that maybe needed some different application. The big point, though, I want to make is just you kind of want a crossover separate from what comes in the subwoofer, because you want to be able to roll off the main speakers, or you might want to roll off the main speakers so that your crossover curves match up nicely. The low-pass filter for the sub and the high-pass filter for the main speakers, so that those blend together nicely. You probably want that. And I think you want a crossover For the main speakers, you want a high-pass filter that rolls off the low end for the main speakers, because one of the great things you could get with a subwoofer is you're not driving your main speakers as hard at low frequencies, and that gives you higher total output levels potentially. And as I've discussed in the past, dynamics require relatively high output capability, even though your average volume level may not be that high. Anyway, so you get a crossover and you want a crossover. Okay, that's part number one. Part number two is the DSP system, which has an interesting design that involves software that runs on a computer or a phone or an iPad. I ran the software on the iPad that I also use for streaming. And what you're doing is the preamp ships with a microphone, and you place the microphone at a 4-foot distance from the main speakers, and you don't have to do anything, by the way. The Legacy is connected to the internet. You tell the cloud to send a test signal to the preamp, and it runs those test signals through the speakers. They're measured with the microphone at the specified point. Then you upload the data you gathered through the microphone. This is all done with an app on, in my case, your iPad. And you send that data to the cloud. Calculations are done on what I like to envision as, a supercomputer in the sky, and then sent back to you, and you load those parameters into the preamp, and those are used as the adjustment curves for the main speakers and the subwoofers to make them blend together in, hopefully, a happy way. Of course, you have a preamp that has a remote control and switching and volume control and multiple inputs and all of the stuff you would expect on a preamp. In addition, you have a D to A converter that can convert high bitrate data streams. I use the USB input, but there's SPDIF and a variety of inputs to the DAC that you can use. And it also has apodizing capability if you want to use that. And I don't want to say I can't imagine why you wouldn't want to use that, but it seems like a beneficial thing to me, and Legacy recommends you use it, so I did. Okay, so all of the components in this thing make sense to me if you're going to use subwoofers. If you're not going to use subwoofers, you don't need the crossover, and really maybe you don't want the DSP. All right, in the next section we'll talk about how it sounded. Just a brief interruption, esteemed viewers. As you may know, I'm Tom Martin, Chief Content Officer of The Absolute Sound. We have a new product. It's on the Substack platform, and we're going to do some interesting things with Substack. First of which is reader questions and answers. Each Monday, readers will submit questions. We'll pick the most interesting ones and we'll answer the questions on Friday. We'll also have early access to articles and special blogs that don't appear anywhere else. We hope you'll join us. It's only a cost of a cup of coffee per month. Just check on the screen or in the show notes below. Thanks, and now back to the show. Okay, after some technical adjustments involving coffee, let's talk about sound quality. I would say, in summary, the bass from the combination of the JL Audio D108s and the Legacy Wavelet preamp together with the Magnepans, which I'm using because I think it's kind of a hard speaker actually to match subwoofers with. Anyway, the combination I thought had very good bass. But I want to pull that apart a little bit so you know what I'm talking about. The first thing I noticed, and key point here, I did this with one setup sequence. I put the woofers in place at the quarter wavelength points. That's where the wall, back wall, well, the front wall from the listener's perspective, and the floor meet at the quarter wavelength point across the front wall. There are some empirical studies that suggest that's good placement, and I wanted to make it relatively easy for the wavelet to do its analysis. So I put them in place there. I set the controls to what I would consider to be neutral, meaning no low-pass filter and the volume set to midway. Remember, the wavelet sets the actual volume, so I just wanted to give it a, midpoint in the range of what the D108s are capable of. Anyway, so I set that up. I put the wavelet microphone in place at its prescribed 4-foot distance from each channel, measured the left channel and the right channel, sent that to the giant computer in the sky. Legacy did its analysis, sent back the coefficients, we uploaded them to the preamp, and I listened. So with one set of adjustments that is really like what you need to do to plug the subwoofer in and to use the DSP, with one set of adjustments I got very natural sounding bass. The transition from the woofer to the Magnepans felt to me quite seamless. And most interesting, I think, is that the bass had a character very similar to what the Maggies have in terms of the texture of the bass. However, the bass with the subwoofers was, as you might expect, deeper and it was more powerful. I did some measurements just to kind of try to see what was going on. My measurements were in the frequency domain, so that's kind of interesting. But the way the wavelet processed things, I ended up with bass that was extended from about 50 hertz down to about 25 hertz, so kind of filling in the bottom octave, I would say. The low bass and mid bass were slightly elevated compared to what the Maggies do on their own by maybe 3 dB, let's say, maybe a little bit more than that in some places. And there was a little fill-in in a dip that I have in this room in the upper bass of maybe 1 or 2 dB. It's not so important exactly what happened in my situation, but in fact what I heard, which was deeper bass and more powerful bass, kind of correlates with a little bit with what I see in the measurements. What I liked and why I say the quality of the bass was very good is that with those additions and changes to the bass, the character of the bass was still that natural, open Magnepan bass that those of you who are Maggie listeners will know and love. It just had more depth and more power. So I was really happy with that. And again, that's with one cycle of measurement. Although, to be honest with you, other than trying a completely different position, which I could do, although I don't really understand how that would be better, but maybe I should try that. Other than trying a completely different position and remeasuring it just in case randomly that works better, I think this is relatively representative of what the system can do. And what I liked about it was so easy to get very good, very enjoyable performance. To kind of put it in the context of what some of you may be used to with subwoofers, I didn't hear any boom, and I didn't hear that upper bass fog where you get a little bit more upper bass, but it's just, I don't know, it just sounds fluffy, and it doesn't sound real. It doesn't sound like it does live. It lacks definition. The other thing I liked about the whole setup was the wavelet comes with some tuning parameters that you can adjust on the app, in my case on an iPad. And so you can adjust what they call punch, low bass, mid bass, and upper bass. And I found that playing with that by, somewhere between 0.1 and 0.3 dB allowed me to, over the course of 10 or 20 recordings, dial in the sound of the bass to be slightly preferable, at least for my tastes, and slightly more natural sounding. But the adjustments were really minor, so I'm not even 100% confident that I was genuinely making improvements. You can also adjust high frequencies, and I'll talk more about high frequencies in a minute. And then the final thing I liked here was it seems like really good value, as I mentioned before, because you get roughly, if you need all of it, which you do if you're going to use the kind of configuration I've got of mains and subs, you get kind of 4 components in one for about $6,000. So that makes it about $1,500 per box for the DAC, the DSP, the electronic crossover, and the preamp. So at $1,500 a box, to my mind, we're not talking about really pricey equipment, and I thought that was extraordinarily good value. If you think of it as a $6,000 preamp, you might not look at it that way, but you can't do the things you can do with this with just a regular preamp. Okay, now I have a few question marks about performance here. I do want to spend a little bit more time playing with the wavelet. So there's the question I raised before of, could I have randomly found a better position for the subs if I reran the DSP calculations a couple of times? Would I come up with something different? Those of you who have played with measurement equipment will know that the exact microphone position can matter a lot to what the computer thinks it's getting as input. I'm not sure that would have been qualitatively noticeable, but sometimes the measurements look different when you move the microphone around by seemingly trivial amounts. So there's that. But the other question marks I've got are, I didn't feel like the bass dynamics, even though the texture and the transparency of the bass was very good, I didn't feel like the dynamics and the transparency of the bass was really equal to speakers that are at maybe 10 times the price. Now you might say, and I would say, of course not, but I'm kind of interested in whether DSP can do semi-magic. And as is often the case in engineering, good engineering can do really good things, but it can't do magic. And, I guess I should know better, but there's certainly room for improvement here. If I used bigger, more powerful subs, would that be better? If I used, and I think this is something really to think about, if I used different main speakers, not because I don't like the Magnepans, because I really do like the Magnepans, but is a more conventional, forward-facing, multi-driver system easier for the wavelet to analyze? That, to me, is a really interesting question. So I may have disadvantaged it by choosing speakers that are hard to blend with. I ended up getting what I thought was a really good blend, but maybe I didn't get that last oomph of bass transparency, and I could have if I gave the wavelet an easier measurement problem. So that's an interesting question. And here to me is the big one. I also have the question of whether accidentally I, in talking with Bill Duddleston, just picked a average good crossover point for the subs of 110 hertz, and actually if I had gone a little bit higher, would I have affected that transparency in a positive way? There are reasons to think that might be the case. There are reasons that might not do anything or might actually make things worse. So that's something that would be, I think, quite interesting to experiment with. My final question mark is about the effect of DSP on high frequencies. What was interesting to me was I thought the quality of the treble was actually very good and very similar to what the wavelet sounds like without the DSP in the circuit. So, and that's where I was expecting maybe the DSP would subtract a little bit from the transparency of the preamp, but I didn't find that to be true. What I did find to be true, and I'm also curious to do more experimentation with, is I found the imaging to change. That doesn't necessarily mean the imaging was worse, because what was interesting was the imaging got substantially wider, and I felt like center fill got a little bit worse. Again, this is one system in one room using potentially odd speakers from the perspective of what the DSP is programmed around. So I don't know, but it did change the imaging in some positive ways, and I don't even know if I can say in some negative ways. Some ways that I felt like I lost something that I was accustomed to, but maybe it wasn't so bad. The more I listened, the more it seemed natural and normal. But I've got a question mark. That's all it is. Question mark is not a substitute in my language for a negative where I'm just trying to smooth over it. I've got a question mark about the effect of the DSP on the imaging of the entire system. It could be a winner there, and that would actually be kind of cool and an unexpected surprise. So we shall see. Anyway, that kind of summarizes what I found. I think this is a phenomenal system for the money. I rate the fact that it's so easy to use very highly. Systems that if you spend a year breaking them in and then another year constantly obsessing about setup, and then finally you can find this Tweakorama combination, are perfectly fine, and if that's how you want to spend your time, that's great. I value simplicity of setup and quickly being able to get to maybe 90% of what the system can do, and then you don't have to do the tweaks, but you can. Okay, that's what I like, because I can sit down and listen to music. I want to put the box or the boxes in my system, set it up, make a few adjustments, listen a little bit, and then go, okay, let's play some music, let's enjoy some music. That's what I'm here for. Those are my values. They don't have to be your values, but I thought that was a great feature of the way this DSP system works. I hope you've enjoyed this. I certainly enjoyed making it, and I'll probably be back with more on the D108s alone, just because I have them, and I think they're at a really nice price point. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. Please subscribe to the channel. Remember, subscribe, click on the notifications bell, and also we'd love it if you would join us on our newsletter, and please visit the website, and of course you can subscribe to the magazine. We try to have a lot of information for you, and we hope you really enjoy it. We love this hobby, and hope you do too. Thanks.